So we're joined today via webcam from Australia by my former professor, Dr. Kinkel. Here, we're at Nova Lab Studios in downtown. Dr. Kinkel, thanks for signing on.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here with you virtually today. It's been a long time.
Yeah, yeah, I'm excited. What's you said you're 17 hours ahead, or you like to think 7 hours behind?
That's right. I like to think 7 hours behind and a day ahead because Australia is just living in the future, but it's technically 17 hours ahead. Yeah. So
S-
so
So how long
it's
have you been there now?
2 years.
Oh,
Moved
it's
here
been
about
2 years.
2 years ago, and yeah, it's weird times these days for everybody. I think, but Australia's doing okay. So.
Yeah, I remember I asked you when we kind of initially started talking how it was. You said it's all right. So
It is. It's nothing like the US right now in terms of the overall number of cases, and some days life feels very normal here, and other days you remember that, the world has changed.
yeah. Yeah. And then prior to that, I don't remember how recent this was, but then there was all those fires going on, right? In
Yeah,
Australia.
that's right. Absolutely. Yeah, over sort of December, Christmas, January. And then there was floods, and now there's been the plague. So I'm waiting for
Yeah.
locusts and maybe frogs. It's been a rough year for parts of Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least it's not as bad there so
No,
far.
no, this part of the plague is not as bad.
So Dr. King, go ahead, give us kind of your background. I know I think it's a very impressive background. So go ahead, just kind of walk us through like all that you've done to and where you currently are now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that.
Mhm.
I'll give you the short version and then we can talk about any parts of it that you think might be particularly of interest.
Sure.
So, I did my bachelor's at Scripps College in Claremont, California. I did my bachelor's in political science and I minored in history. My first job out of college was I was an admissions counselor at a private college in LA, and I didn't technically get fired, but I did get asked to leave. Um, so I did leave, and then I worked at Target for 2 years as a customer service manager. Went from Target to Yale, where I got my PhD in history. Then I was a postdoc for 3 years while I was frantically looking for a full time job, which we can definitely talk about. And then I ended up at Ohio University, where we met. And taught American history there, sort of colonial American history, Native American history, empires, which was really fantastic. And I loved being there. And then a couple of years ago, I guess 2 years ago, when I moved to Australia, I left that job and have now pivoted my career again. I'm still in higher ed, but now I'm working at the University of Technology, Sydney in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Unit, where I'm the partnerships manager. And I work to build and maintain good relationships with corporate, startup, government, nonprofit organizations, and the university so that we can try to really, I think, help educate and prepare students for the future of work and just all the future skills that they're going to need. So that's my journey. And again, it already I'm not 40 yet, and I have a couple career pivots in there. So I think that's definitely the way of the future.
Yeah, that's honestly that's a lot of the premise of this whole thing that I do is that it's all those pivots. That's why like I named it what I named it, the forked road, because you think you're going one way and then it's like, okay, I'm gonna make a decision here. Then you take whichever way you go, and then you're like, okay, this is where I'm gonna be, and then it's like, nope, gonna make another decision here. And obviously it depends on the person, but again, like you said, in such a short amount of time, you went from complete opposite spectrums and from one end of the world to the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you say, you end up getting put in these places where, again, the road forks in front of you. And sometimes it's your own decision where you go from there. And that has certain challenges, but also empowerment about it. And sometimes it's not entirely your decision where you go from there. And I think that can be harder still than learning how to make the best out of a situation that you don't always entirely choose.
Yeah, definitely. So you started poli sci. That was your bachelor's major.
Yep, that's right.
What brought you to that? What made you think I'm gonna do poli sci?
Yeah, I was really so I did it was sort of political science with an international relations focus, and I was really interested in learning about the world and thinking about how policies get made and how governments relate to one another. So I thought that that would be interesting for me. I thought maybe I'd go to the State Department or something. I didn't have a clear sense of really where I wanted to go from there. I just thought it would be interesting to learn about, and it was. I enjoyed that. I ended up with an accidental minor in history. All my elective classes were history classes. And
Mm,
so later on, when I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do I actually want to do with my life? I was like, okay, well, if all the classes you actually chose were history classes, maybe that should be a little bit of a hint that that's actually really what you love. Thinking about almost actually exactly, I think, some of these things we've been talking about. What helps people make decisions? Why do people make the choices that they make? Why do they try to live the lives that they try to live? What do they value? What do they prioritize? And how do we understand? How does understanding our past help prepare us for the future, right?
mm.
We're, I think, talking about this, stay on a little bit of a personal level, but I think societies do it too.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
started in poli sci and realized that actually history was really what I loved.
Yeah, I think honestly in your teaching, I think it's pretty evident because
Oh yeah, thanks.
because I think when I had your class, it was your first year
It
at
was
our
my
school, right?
very first semester. You were very kind to be so generous about my teaching. I had a lot to, I think, like anytime you do something for the first time, there's a lot to learn. I really loved what we were talking about, but I think I'm sure I got better and better and better. So I always appreciated your compliments because your first time you're doing something, you could use the support.
Because if correct me if I'm wrong, didn't while you were at Yale, didn't you also do like a TA kind of thing? Weren't you like doing like a adjunct, not adjunct? Weren't you some kind of professor there too, or
Yeah, so
some
I
kind of
had,
teaching?
that's right. Yeah, so I had done some teaching at Yale, both as a teaching assistant for full professors. I had co-taught a class with a historical sociologist friend of mine. And so I wasn't coming in with no teaching background, but I certainly hadn't taught some of these subjects I hadn't actually taught for the first, I hadn't taught previously, and hadn't been quite as fully responsible all on my own
Mm,
before. And it's just, you're always working with, anytime I think you move schools, whether that's schools or you move jobs, you have new colleagues, new coworkers. There's different cultures, different expectations, and I was trying to figure out what would resonate with the students at OU and how I could connect to them.
yeah, because I remember when I was going through the process of selecting my classes. Your first year was it 2015?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so it was my first semester too then, because I transferred in. I transferred from over here in LA. So I remember I was looking at our what I forgot what it was called, the DARs or whatever. I was like my
That's right.
classes, and
Yeah, absolutely.
I still had some of like the GE classes left, I think.
Yeah.
So when I was looking at, because I like learning about history, like I'll watch stuff on my own time, and even like through prior education, I just those were one of the classes I was just generally interested in anyway. So I was like, okay, well, and then American Indian history, because that's what it was, right? It was survey to
That's
American
right.
Indian history.
Yep,
That
absolutely.
that all already interested me too. So I'm like, okay, maybe this is one of the. So I thought about it, and like I think like a lot of students, like every class that I circled as a potential thing, I would just hop on to rate my professors and then put in the name to see which who's taught, what have they taught, and then
Yeah.
I remember it came to yours and there was nothing. I'm like, oh, she must be new then, or just I don't
Yeah.
know, people haven't think this. I'm like, well, whatever. The topic sounds interesting, so I'll take
Yeah.
my chances.
Yeah.
And then, but I think from the get go, it was one thing at least for me that helps. I probably for a lot of students, but for me, it helps to have a very structured classroom at least, because then it keeps me a little bit more in line too, just with the whole thing. And yours was and it's super structured, but it wasn't rigid. At least I didn't think. I thought it was just very. It made it very easy to maneuver. You kind of weren't surprised when things were happening, so that was helpful. And then just honestly, the way that you taught was, I think, at least to that point, one of the first times I had a professor like that, because I think that's an important thing and part of the reason why people maybe get deterred when it comes to school and in any subject. Because this had nothing to do with my major. I majored in finance. This was
Right.
in history. Like I could have gotten a C, and it really wouldn't have impacted what I was doing. But you you just made the class legitimately enjoyable to learn. But not every professor has that, whether it's intentional or unintentional. I don't think anyone intentionally tries to make the class sucky, unless you're, maybe like a,
No,
yeah. But
but
so I
I
guess the
do, yeah,
long-winded part of that is, so
yeah.
how were you? Do you think? Well, I don't even know if you thought this, but how do you think you were able to uh mold the class like that, essentially?
Well, again, thank you. And I agree with you. I think we've all had some professors at various points in our life where you're like, oh my gosh, how are you not putting yourself to sleep? Why are you even here today?
Yeah, yeah.
I think that one of the things that always resonated with me was you have to find what you're talking about interesting. If you don't
Mm,
find it interesting, then why should anyone else? And also for me, that always meant trying to connect it out to the bigger picture. Why are we talking about what we're talking about today? Why should anyone care? Like, seriously, who cares? What's the big picture here? Why does it matter? But then I think the other thing that you can sometimes get away from in history is you zoom out too much and it's these huge structural forces with all the real people taken out. And the thing is that history is made up of all these real people making real choices and living real lives. So you have to have that big picture, why does any of this matter view? But you also really need to remember that it's this conglomeration, this constellation of real people's lives, and it has to be grounded in those real people. And I think for me, what's always really interesting about history comes back to the stories. And that is usually, those are people's stories, right? I tell myself that's why I love gossip so much because I'm interested in people and people's lives, and history at some level is just like slightly intellectualized gossip, a little bit.
yeah,
Not
that's
totally,
an
but a
interesting way to
little
put
bit.
it. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was how I tried to think about it was if I were a student, I would want to know why I was there and why I should care, and I would want to know something real,
Hmm.
I guess.
Yeah, that helps. I mean, because again, like kind of while you were saying all that, it all makes a lot of sense. But I mean, I was kind of fortunate, at least at OU. My professors, I didn't really have a sucky professor that I can
Yeah.
legitimate. Even if I could think of, I'll say it, I just won't say their name. But I, at least right now, I can't think of them. Now I
Yeah.
don't know. So, and that's kind of something I kind of talked about with like my friends when I came back. Because again, if you're going from LA to Ohio, especially like Athens, where it's like
Mhm.
a college town, there's really nothing going on
Yeah.
outside of like Court Street. People would ask me like, "Why'd you go there?" And then I kind of gave them the reason, but then they're like, "So like, was it like even like a legitimate school? Like I've never heard of it." I'm like, actually, believe it or not, like it was really good. Like I, at least again, my experience, the classes I took, and also it does matter what you put into it.
Yeah.
That's something I talked about with other guests too. I mean, you can easily go through really any school. It could be Harvard, it doesn't matter, go wherever. And then if you're just really like dead about it, you're not overly enthused, you're just there for whatever reason, it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. It's gonna suck anyway. So
Yeah.
it helps to at least have an attitude shift at some point. Um,
Absolutely. I
and
couldn't agree
professors
with
like
you
that
more.
that do things like that does help though.
No, no, no. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. First of all, I agree. I always was impressed by my colleagues in the history department at OU. Certainly, they were a lot of smart people who cared about students and cared about their teaching, and I think really invested a lot of themselves in it. And across the faculty, other departments as well. But I think your point that you made after that, that education is something that you have to invest in. And I think that's what challenges this shift a little bit towards thinking about education as a product that you can buy. And that's not quite right because it is not really quite a consumer product. It's actually, you'll only get out of it what you put into it. And you have to invest yourself because you're trying to change yourself. It's like saying, you know, I bought a gym pass, I have a gym membership, so I guess I'll just inherently get fit without putting the effort in, but that's not how it works. I wish
Right.
it was, but it's not. And education's the same way. You can pay your tuition and say, well, now I'm getting my education, but if you're not actually putting the effort in, I'm not sure you're going to transform the way that you want to.
I'm curious in so you taught at, you had some classes you taught at Yale, you
Mhm,
taught at OU. So
mhm.
between the two places that between those places, what would you say was like the general what's the word? Like what in those classes, the students generally, what did their like attitudes seem like? Would you say a majority seemed like they were there because they wanted to be? A majority couldn't care less? Was there like a healthy blend? What was like the temperament of the students in general that you think was, fairly?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that I've always liked my students. I liked my students at Yale. I actually really liked my students at OU. I had a lot of really great students at OU that I thought put a lot into it. I was surprised sometimes that there were students who, and I mean, again, maybe my class didn't connect with them. Maybe this wasn't their major and they just needed the credit. They didn't really care about the grade. Okay, well, that's fine. I mean, we can all choose how to prioritize our energies. There were occasionally people that I wasn't, again, totally sure why they were there as
Mm,
students, because I was just, there was one student um, who had been doing really well all semester. He was on track to probably get an A minus, and he had a personal crisis towards the end of the semester and just really needed a little bit of time away. And he had all of the reasonable excuses for why that was. He didn't really do his final assignment, and I said that either he could, I was like, you've been doing so well up till now. I could give you an extension and you could come back and you could try to finish this next semester when you're, in a better place. Or given that you basically failed the final assignment, you can take the C. And he just took the C.
mm,
That really surprised me because I guess maybe because I couldn't imagine myself doing that.
right.
But I think one of the things that also surprised me just a little bit was I had students at OU who I definitely think were as smart as any of the students I taught at Yale, and put a lot of effort in. Um, they, I wasn't always sure what kinds of aspirations they had for themselves.
Mm,
And again, that's fine. Life's about a lot of things, and I don't think that everybody needs to want to see them. Not everybody needs to want to see themselves as a CEO or in the White House. You can live a really meaningful, complete life and not necessarily have that be your aspiration. I wasn't always sure though that they sort of even knew what they wanted 5 years out of uni or 10 years out or anything like that. And so that would be actually one of the big differences that I saw, not necessarily in sort of intelligence or in how hard some people worked, but in the students at Yale all sort of believed that they were going somewhere, I guess, rightly or wrongly. I'm not even sure that they all deserved to believe that, but they did. And I was a little surprised and sometimes at OU that students that I thought had every right to believe that maybe didn't believe it,
mm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Do you think part of that line of thinking maybe has to do with the status of the school, whether it actually be, fair or not? Probably it is, but regardless, because obviously you go to someone, you're like, I went to Yale, or you go to someone, you say I went to Ohio University. They're either not gonna know Ohio University, or they're gonna, which 90% of the time with me, when I say I went to Ohio University, like, oh, cool, Ohio State. I'm like, nope, different school.
Yep, me too. Me too. In fact, I actually had to correct some of my family members about that for years. They'd be like, "How's Ohio State?" And I'd be like, "Well, I think it's great, but I'm not teaching there."
Yeah. Yeah, so do you think part of it is that is where, so you have it's an Ivy League school, it's already, inherently, if you tell someone you went to Yale, they're going to assume you're probably a genius. I think generally, at least, I don't know, maybe not everyone, but I feel like people would assume you're more likely to be smarter if you went to Yale as opposed to if you went to Ohio University, for example. So given that you got into Yale, do you think part of it, like you said, rightly or wrongly, them feeling like they belonged there was because, like, well, I got into here, whereas opposed to maybe someone that went to OU, it's like, well, yeah, it's a good school, but again, it's not Yale.
Yeah, I definitely think that there is a little bit of confirmation bias,
Mm,
in the sense that, okay, well, I got into Yale, and then you believe that you're destined for bigger things. And sometimes there's opportunities that open up to you that, yeah, maybe other people don't have a chance to have.
right.
And so I really think that it is harder to get into some of those schools than it is to be there. Way,
Okay.
way, 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 way more people could do well at those schools than have the opportunity to go there. Um, so once you sort of won that lottery, because let's face it, it is a little bit of a lottery. In that, again, not everyone who could be successful there has that opportunity. Once you've won that lottery, um, yeah, there's then lots of people who could, I think, make the best of that. So I do think that you that it's not down to just natural talent, that it compounds on itself a little bit, and part of it's about a belief in yourself, and part of it's about some of those doors that maybe do open from there. But I don't think it's about entirely about natural talent.
Okay. So when you're dealing with like those instances where you're saying you're seeing students that, for whatever reason, maybe they're not really trying or they were and then they kind of stopped. As a professor who, again, where it's clear that you actually care about what the outcome of the students are, how do you feel when you see that? And then, which I'm assuming is like, well, this sucks. I wish they cared more. I wish they were kind of doing what they were initially. So, but how do you combat it? Because I'm pretty sure there's only so much one that you can do and what you're allowed to do. So how do you even balance that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would try, and there were a couple of times while I was at OU that I had students who clearly were going through some stuff. And you're right, some of that's straight up not your business. As their professor, you can only do so much. Some of it's really deeply private. I tried, when students were interested in talking to me, to talk to them about what was going on and to see if there was a way that I could help, whether it was actual concrete help. I'd be happy to look at your draft, or maybe we can work on an extension, or can I direct you to some resources, or whether it's just to be a sounding board about some other
Mhm.
stuff that was happening in their life. I think sometimes just knowing that you can have someone who listens to you matters a lot. And I think I would try to reiterate, as in the case of the student that we just talked about before, that I believed in them, and that I know that I know how cheesy that sounds, right? I believe in you. But seriously, sometimes you just need someone to say, "Look, I
Yeah.
really believe in you. I think you can do this. I can see for whatever reason right now you maybe don't believe that, but I believe it." And then sometimes you actually do just have to let them go live their own life. And I think the good news in some ways is that we all are going to make a lot of mistakes, and a lot of the stuff you can bounce back from. People go through some hard times. Again, some of it's because of choices they make, and some of it's just something that's outside of their control. But that first setback, that time, again, that time you get asked to leave that first job, not technically fired, but not technically not fired either, it feels like the end of the world. And maybe that first time that you take the C instead of the A or whatever, it feels like a big deal, but it's only really a big deal until the next milestone in your life. By the time you have the next job that you don't get fired from, and by the time that you move on to sort of the next class and the next academic achievement, a lot of these things that feel like they're going to stay with you forever don't actually. And that was one of the things that I started to realize, was that sometimes, again, for some of these students, I couldn't help. They needed different kinds of help. I wasn't in a position to be that person for them. But also, it was going to be okay. And I hope it is. I don't actually know what happened to all of the people, but I think it was probably going to be okay, and they got through it. And even if it meant it took a couple more years to graduate, even if it meant they didn't end with the sterling GPA they maybe wanted, those things actually have a little bit shorter lifespan sometimes than you think they do.
You're mentioning like students utilizing their resources. So again, with my experience with you, it was very you were one very accessible, and you also spent a lot of time like working on, like I remember with like your papers and your drafts. You definitely would help a lot, and in a like it seems dumb to say, but in a helpful way. Like you wouldn't say do this, which at times for me was frustrating. Frustrating in that it's like, just give me the rest of the answer. Like, you're
Yeah.
pretty much there. Like, just give me that whatever was left.
Yeah.
But because you didn't, though, it made it that much more of a learned experience as opposed to like a given experience.
Well, I
So
So, and I agree. I think we worked on about 4 different drafts for one of
yeah.
your essays. And I could see that you were frustrated, which, I understand, but I think you're right that if the whole point is to learn how to do it, then you sort of have to do it. And I think that one of the things that I always try to remind people, um, the first time you do anything, of course you're not going to know what you're doing. That's okay. I had a student in a later class who was just really worked up. This was the first essay she'd written since high school, and she was just really worked up about it. And that's okay. It's one essay. I'll look at your draft. You won't get everything right the first time, but we'll work on it together. And by working on it, you'll understand better. And the same thing happens in your careers and your jobs as well. I think people can sometimes get a little fixated on whether they know how to do everything on day one. You're not going to know how to do everything on day one. That's even more true, of course, in school, because part of the reason
Right.
why you're there is you're learning how to do it. If you already knew how to do it, you wouldn't have to be there.
Would you say a fair amount of your students would actually utilize you in that regard though?
No, no, I had a handful of students, sort of in any given semester, I had a handful of students who'd come and see me a lot and we'd chat a lot. And there'd be a lot of students who I definitely tried to make myself accessible and reiterate, here's my office.
You
I
did.
basically live
Yep.
there. Come and see me
Yeah, you definitely
anytime.
did.
Um, but, and I actually remember when I was an undergrad, I never went to see the professors. In retrospect, it was one of the stupidest things I did as an undergrad. I never went to their office. I never talked to them. I can't believe now that I didn't use those resources that were available to me. And I thought that if I went to see the professor and asked a question, they'd think I was dumb.
Hmm.
And again, now in retrospect, I'm like, well, you were dumb for not going. I mean, so I do understand the reluctance a little bit. But given that it's meant to be, your education is a learning experience and you only get out of it when you engage in it. I wish I'd been a little bit smarter then and a little bit less caught up in perfection, because I think I would have, learned more and built some really good connections.
Yeah, because the reason I ask if people utilized that resource specifically with you is because I think, at least again from my experience, it was clear that people didn't.
No, no.
Um, so part of me wonders is like one why. So part of it might be, well, I just don't care because I'm
Yeah.
curious. So again, yours was a history class, and it was one of the ones that, at least if you're a business major, and I don't know about other school like college, all the colleges at OU, if it fell under that same elective option.
Mm.
So I don't even know. Maybe you can confirm it. Like, would you even say the majority of the students in those classes were even history majors, or were they kind of other ones?
No, for Native American history, the majority of the students were not history majors. Some of my other classes would be a little bit more heavily history
Probably like the
majors.
upper level ones, I'm
Yeah,
assuming.
exactly. Yeah. Some smaller seminars. But no, there were a lot of people there who were, which also I'll say, I think that's great. I think everybody should be learning something about history. So it's
Right.
never a problem for me to have had non-history majors in there. And sometimes you realize that maybe you want the history minor or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so it's definitely possible. Yeah, maybe they didn't care. I wrote pretty detailed notes on everybody's paper every single time, and
Hmm.
you'd get the next paper back, and they wouldn't have done anything different. So I'm not sure that they were that invested in it. And like I said, I recognize people have limited time and resources, and not everybody. They may have been making perfectly rational choices, and they were really investing themselves in their other classes. Okay, well that's fine. Um, but I think that it may have been a little bit of a missed opportunity to have someone who wanted to help you get better at some of these skills that I think are going to be really important, sort of no matter what your career is.
Hmm.
I'd be interested actually to hear you talk a little bit. I know you were doing sort of business finance major, but a lot of what we learned about in our classes together, critical thinking and critical reading and strong communication. And I sort of suspect that some of those skill sets have probably, I hope, come back to be useful for you. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And the thing that I say with a lot of like when I talk to people in general about my schooling, a lot of like the actual subject matter I do not retain. And it's not it's to no fault of the professors. It's just like especially after like starting work, so
Yeah.
much of my work knowledge just ends up cluttering my brain that
Yeah.
my retention of that kind of goes away. But like
Yeah.
I don't know, was that a soft skill? Whatever, soft or hard, I don't know, whichever it is, like what your question, those
Yeah.
skills I think easily were translated. And I think
Yeah.
because those were more like embedded and it wasn't necessarily like a knowledge like fact kind of thing, but it was more like a knowledge like utility kind of thing. And I think the reason it stayed in is
Yeah.
because I ended up actually utilizing it.
Yeah.
Whereas opposed to some of like even the finance or the history, whatever, that I learned it there and I used it then, but ever since I left, it hasn't come up yet.
Yeah.
So I haven't necessarily used it. So those weren't, but like something like what you just described, those definitely did. And part of it I think was because of that.
I think that resonates with me as well. There are a lot of classes that I took over the years where, like you, I don't really remember much of the content. I remember some key talking points,
Yeah.
one or two interesting facts, again, maybe a story that would help sort of encapsulate some of what we were talking about. But that's actually, again, your experience to me strikes me as being broadly the point that I don't actually think that students need to come out of history classes now memorizing all those facts about history. I hope the reason why it's useful is because it does teach you some of those soft skills, and the skills themselves are really what's so important. And if you also now remember, again, a handful of interesting things about Native American history that you didn't know before, yeah, actually, I'm willing to count that as a success, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. Because kind of the reason why I'm asking about the resources, because so as I was kind of talking through it and as you were answering, I was thinking, well, maybe since some of the classes were majority non-history majors, maybe that's kind of why they didn't care as much. But as I thought a little more while that was kind of developing, I was like, well, actually, no, I don't think that's even right because I'm thinking about like my finance classes that were like
Mm.
exclusive to finance majors or business majors, and just from the general interaction in some of those classes, again, I would assume probably, and I'm not saying like I was going to every professor. I was only going really if I was like I don't get it, because there's
Yeah.
some that I just got it, or for whatever
Yeah.
reason I'm like
Sure.
whatever. But like that stigma, and I think the stigma you described is there, where you're like, well, I don't know, maybe it seems like I'm dumb if I go ask those questions.
Yeah.
I think for whatever reason some people do feel that, but I was like, I don't even care if I look dumb. I gotta figure. I don't get it. I
Yeah.
need someone to
Yeah.
explain it.
But that's such a great um, capability to have, though, and sort of at some fundamental level, like a little bit of a self confidence to it as well, to know that you want to know the answer, and it's okay in the short term to admit that you don't know the answer, so that you can learn it in the medium to longer term, right?
Yeah.
I think that's just such an important skill to be able to learn, to be able to say, I don't currently know. Because if you don't admit that you don't currently know, how do you learn in a
Yeah.
medium or longer term?
But why? What do you think? If you were to like guess, what do you think is the reason that students even have that in them? Is it just something that's carried from them? That's just like an internal thing? Is it possible maybe a professor kind of gives that off? Because I feel like maybe some professors might come off standoffish, where like I don't even want to ask a question; they seem terrifying.
Yeah. So I suspect it's probably a combination of factors, and probably a little different for different people. I suspect that some professors do have a little bit of a, I can't believe you're in my office asking me about this. Thanks
Mm,
for wasting my time vibe. Like that might occasionally be the case. And I do think that sometimes people are worried that, yeah, that maybe they will look stupid. And I do also think that for often they may not, yeah, maybe at some fundamental level it doesn't matter enough to them to put in the effort to find out how to get better at it, either because they don't see it as being central to what matters to them in the future, or they don't understand why it matters. Again, that's so like, we're here, why are we learning this, so what, so why should I care about whether I get better at communicating my thoughts in writing?
mm,
And the answer is, well, I ends up actually, I think, being really important to a lot of people's future careers. So it's not about can you communicate about Native American history, it's just about can you communicate. And I think
yeah.
that's the
Period.
so what for that. But I think maybe for some people it's not clear, and they want there to be that direct connection, so they know why it's useful. Like, what's the utility?
Mm. So you were mentioning earlier, like how with every student you gave like detailed notes.
Mm.
Uh, so I guess it's two-parter. One, because I've submitted essays with other professors, like even for like English classes. I don't honestly distinctly remember them being as detailed as yours. So part one of my question is, w- is there? It's a weird question to ask. Why? Like
Okay.
how and why do you actually go that into it?
Yeah.
And then two, I think the you may have kind of answered it, but I guess for a reiteration. So, because you mentioned some students you would do that. It wasn't like some people you would do it, some you wouldn't. So you kind of gave that same thoroughness to everyone.
Mhm.
But like you said, some just the next essay was the same style.
Yep.
So how do you still do it again? Even you're like, well, they're probably not even going to change anything, but this is like, how do you even maintain it?
Yeah, so in terms of the why, it really struck me that if I didn't do that detailed feedback, again, if you don't know where you've gone a little bit wrong, how can you fix it in the future? And I didn't think that it would be enough. If someone hands in a 10-page essay, it's not enough to just write on the back, needed a proofread. Well, that could mean a lot of things. Like you actually need more. And if you don't get more substantive, helpful feedback, how do you get better? And it felt like a bit of a moral obligation as your
Mm,
teacher to give that kind of feedback. That's why they were paying me those big academic bucks. And of course, here's where we need the asterisks. There are no big academic bucks, but that's why they were paying me the big bucks, to actually invest that time and to help people learn. And that was what I guess kept me going back and doing it over and over again, even when I knew that, you know, maybe in a class, maybe I'd do it on 50 papers and maybe, look, I don't actually know how many people would read them properly. I suspect
Not
a
the
pretty small
majority.
percentage.
Yeah.
But it felt like that was part of the job, right? It's not enough, I don't think, to just stand up there and try to deliver content. If you don't help mentor people, they can't get better.
Yep.
And that's really what struck me. I wanted people to develop and learn and feel like they came out of my classes, I hope, a better thinker and a better writer than they came into it. And if I didn't do my part, then they couldn't do their part.
Yeah, because the reason I'm asking is because again, I'm just thinking, I'm like, there's no way it's just a majority that appreciate it. And it's not, maybe it's again, it's not intentional. It's not like, well, I don't like the professor, so I'm not, it's, I doubt it's that. It's just more like, whatever, dude, I don't care.
Yeah,
So that's why like it's kind of dumbfounding to me that a professor can still maintain it. Where it's like, well, still gonna churn it out anyway, still gonna give it as detailed as I was this one person that I know does actually read it. Because
yeah.
there's like out of that 50, I would say, I don't know, maybe like generously 10
Oh yeah,
seems
10
generous.
sounds generous. I was going to start with 5 and then I was like, "Oh, let's not be too harsh. Maybe 10." I think somewhere in that would be a fair estimate of how many people read those comments in detail. Um but that's okay. Because maybe I always thought as well that there was a chance that maybe it'd be one of the students that I didn't even know was actually paying attention or cared, and I didn't
Hmm.
want to deny that student, whatever edification they could get from my feedback, as brilliant as I'm sure my feedback is. But you don't want to prejudge who maybe actually is paying attention. And it felt like I, again, sort of continually owed people the chance to keep trying to get better.
Hmm.
And at some level, of course, it is also, all jokes aside, I do genuinely think that's part of the job. And I do actually feel a little bit the teachers who aren't willing to put that in. I know it's a little demoralizing sometimes, but it's it's part of what you have to do, I think.
Hmm. So while you've been there in Australia, I know. So is it fair to say like yours now more on like the business side of academics? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I'm definitely now in the administrative side and sort of, in some ways, I guess, supporting some of the other teaching and curricular and research functions here at the university. I'm not doing any teaching right now, and I'm not doing any research at the moment. So I'm trying to, what ended up occurring to me was, I always, some of the things that we've been talking about here, right? It matters to me that students help develop these skills that I think will set them up to have happy fulfilled careers, whatever that means to them, to have a life that is meaningful to them, and also, I hope, to be engaged and confident citizens. That's another thing that I think universities really important for. I want people to have the tools in their repertoire to be able to listen to political discourse and engage in their communities. That's really important. And I thought that my job at OU was a good way of doing that, but it's not the only way of doing it. And so here, what our unit does is, again, to try to help teach students entrepreneurial and innovative mindsets, to teach them critical thinking and problem solving and strong communication and empathy with the wants and needs of people who aren't necessarily like you. And I think those are all a lot of the same skill sets that I think are going to be really important in people's future lives.
Because the reason I kind of asked to kind of get an idea of what like side you're on there is because so you've taught here, you kind
Yeah.
of have a gist of how education system works here. From I guess where you are now and the capacity and the people you interact with, is there any drastic difference you're noticing at least with Australia and here in terms of I don't know, like for example, if in people maybe that you talk with, is the engagement more there? Is the engagement less there with students? S- any things off top of your head that are very different?
Yeah. So I have to say, I don't have as much engagement with students here as I
Yeah.
would like, because as you know, I really loved working with students and I do miss it sometimes. I always jump at any chance they give me to stand up and talk in front of students. It's a real blast from the past for me. I think one of the things that is different broadly about the way that just education in general is approached here, there's still a little bit more, I think, of a sense that it's a bit of a public good. And
Mm,
university in Australia is much less expensive than it
mm,
is in the United States. And so I think from that perspective, there's less of that sense that you've invested maybe $100,000 in it. And so you're now going to walk away with the product that you've bought.
mm,
Um, because people aren't mostly, again, coming out with that kind of debt that we do sometimes see in the US, I think that there's still a sense that it's meant to be accessible to everybody.
mm.
So, these are all things that are in flux, and the Australian higher ed system's actually in the middle of maybe a little bit of they're restructuring how some of the funding works, and we'll see what comes out of it. But I guess that would probably be my sense a little bit.
Okay. So then I guess at least with your experience here then when you were teaching so what do you so I guess part of it kind of feeds with what we've already discussed, some of like the issues, if it's fair to say, in terms of like people kind of not caring or just being, I don't know, maybe shy, reluctant, whatever it might be. Is there something that, for example, like going from high school to college in like that transitionary period that could prepare students to maybe be more engaged and more involved and more aware of certain activities? Because like for example, I'm trying to think at when I started at OU, sorry, when I my initial semester when I started school here for college, I think I was already aware of like career fairs, for example, but that's because like I was like reading my emails and stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm also know people that legitimately have no clue that that's even a thing that
Yeah.
happens. So I feel like maybe there are things that can be done to kind of better prepare people. That's just one example. But again, with your experience, when you deal with the college students already sitting in front of you, do you ever see certain things that are like, this probably should have already been resolved? Like this shouldn't still be a problem now.
Oh, I mean, sure. I do think that some students were really let down, I think, by some of their high school education, and they weren't given, um, I suspect some of their high school teachers didn't actually give them the routine, detailed feedback that they needed to improve.
Mm,
And I think that it's hard. I certainly found that there were times when I really felt like I needed to tell the student, you straight up failed at this assignment. It's honestly not even really close. And that was hard on me. I didn't want to have to give that feedback. And I know obviously it was presumably much more challenging on the student to have to receive it. I think that we have to get a little bit better at saying, I see that you tried. However, this was not a successful attempt. So let's work on it again together so that you can get better so that the next attempt is better. So giving people a little bit more room to fail and not feeling like, not necessarily, you don't. So one of the things I'm really grateful about that I got asked to leave that job so early in life was it struck me that it was actually really better to have that failure and that learning experience early on
Mm.
so that I didn't have to make it again later in my 30s,
Right.
right? I had that really sharp awakening that I was not as awesome as I thought I was. And I probably needed to start thinking about and doing some things different at, 22, 23. That was a good time to have that. So I'd rather we let students fail on an assignment so that they don't fail a class, so they don't fail a year, so that they actually hopefully can get some points of intervention earlier rather than later. Because I guess I feel like my sense is if you don't ever course correct, sooner or later, like it's going to catch up with you, right? That failure's coming. But wouldn't you rather have it sooner rather than later when the stakes are a little bit lower? So I think
Definitely.
that's one thing. I think I've increasingly come around to the idea that in Australia and in Europe as well, it's quite common to take a gap year, take a year off between high school and college. I think I'd like to see that become a little bit more standard in the US,
Mm.
whether that's, often people travel. That's obviously not as feasible right now. But whether it's even just working for a year or doing some form of community service, I think it would help people recommit to their education so that you're a
Mm.
little bit less burned out. You haven't gone straight through. You've had some other kinds of experiences and you have a bit of a better sense of why you're there. I think often students have gone to university because their parents want it and their parents want it for good reasons.
Right.
But the student themselves hasn't actively chosen to be there, hasn't invested themselves in being there. And I would like students to have that chance to step back a little bit so they can step back in with a little bit more intentionality and a little bit more commitment. That would be one of the things I'd like to see.
I've heard of that before, that gap year.
Yeah.
At least to me, when I hear that, I'm like, oh, the reason, again, it's a personal thing that wouldn't work with me is because I would feel like the further I get removed from education, the less likely I am to return to it. And again, that's me. Not necessarily everyone's going to be that way because like that's kind of been one of the things I'm realizing now. So
Yeah.
I got my bachelor's like 3 years ago now. So I'm
Yeah.
3 years removed from the last time I took a class, and I've contemplated an MBA. There are several factors into it. It's not just do I want to go or not. I factor everything into it. But I feel like the more time that passes, at least again, me, I probably won't resume. But I can also see the benefit in that gap year, along with the things you mentioned. It's just like a reset because you again
Yeah.
maybe you shake off like a bad year, a bad ending, or a bad thing, and you know maybe traveling somehow something clicks while you're traveling. You're like, you know what, I want to keep doing this, so maybe I go to school. Something works out, find a job, whatever. Maybe I need that to be able to make this a more common thing or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But to me, a gap year is a scary concept. Again, but personal
I
preference. But I can see the benefit of it.
No, so I do. I take your point. I think it is in some ways a scary idea. I don't know that I would have wanted to do it as a high school senior. I think it would have scared me too. I think the scariness of it is maybe part of actually why it's a good thing. I think it challenges you to think about your assumptions and your priorities.
Mm,
But I
that's
also
fair.
do take your point that it might. I remember someone telling me that about going to graduate school. They thought you should go straight out of undergrad because they said, oh, well, look, once you take that time away, you're not going to want to go back. Now, I didn't go straight through, but I was actually really grateful for that. The people I knew who did go straight through from undergrad to grad school burned out. They didn't want to be there. They'd never, and they didn't know why they were there. I think
Right.
often, they didn't know what their other alternatives were and they hadn't fully committed to being there. They didn't it was sort of a negative choice rather than a positive choice. And I think at some level, maybe the idea of the gap year, there might also be some privilege inherent in that, right? Of what a privileged thing to say. Oh, take a year off and go travel.
Yeah, I can see that.
Um, you're like, well, that's great. That must be really nice. That's not feasible for everybody, and I think that's accurate. I think a bigger picture issue is that I think we've built a world where people feel like they have to go to university. It's the only choice for them to be able to have a life that's worthwhile or meaningful, or they're scared of what will happen if they don't. And I know there's some programs now in some other countries. It's big in the UK. It's happening a little bit in Australia as well, to try to bring back apprenticeships. To say that you can get, like, even for traditionally white collar jobs, right? There's the sense of an apprenticeship for some kind of trade professions, whether, it's being a plumber, an electrician, but
Mhm.
even for like being an accountant, for example, maybe there's things that you learn from being on the job in an accounting firm that are actually more useful than what you might learn in the classroom. And maybe there shouldn't be only one path to a career and only one path through an education. I'm not an expert in that,
Right.
but it strikes me that it's probably a useful conversation to have, to think about how we help people figure out what they want their career or job goals to be.
Right.
And maybe there is more than one way there. Maybe actually university shouldn't have to be the only path for people to get. I'm actually pretty confident it shouldn't have to be people's only path to get stable, meaningful employment.
Yeah, that's actually the last thing that you were saying. That was what I was jotting down, is should everyone go to school? Because I don't think the answer is yes, and I think
Yeah,
you just displayed that is. And it's funny you mentioned the apprenticeship, because there's a podcast that I listen to, and this person's mentioned that before. It was like, well, why did we even deviate from it? What happened? Because I think
yeah,
that it does make sense, kind of what you're saying. For example, if you want to be an accountant, maybe you get to shadow one for 15 hours a week, whatever it is,
yeah,
and you actually see, because there's two pros to this. The first I can think of here is, oh, accounting sucks, I don't want to do it. Look at what's going on, whatever, whether and
yeah,
everything, whatever it is, right? You see what they're
yeah,
doing, the hours, the responsibilities, like, oh, no way. And then also also see, like, oh no, I do like this. I like this setting. I like this office, whatever. And
yeah,
I actually, yeah, I do like this. And now because like I mentioned earlier, I learned a lot in school, and
yeah,
not that it was useless, but what I've done post school, maybe 0.5%, 1% of what I
yeah,
learned in school is now being used on any job that I've had.
yep,
Now, certain concepts obviously help, but the actual function, like the actual what I'm doing, the systems being used, is and part of it is it's just not feasible for all those things to be crammed into a 4-year thing. And given just how the system is comprised now, it's not doable. But
yeah.
maybe when you have apprenticeship introduced, that maybe opens up that opportunity.
I think so. And again, I definitely do not think there's one right answer here for
Right.
everybody. I
Right.
think that hopefully the point of a, sort of a liberal arts education, which is what OU did, and does, is to help you become a better thinker. But those skills those skills are important in your career, but they're not always 100% directly transferable. And there would be other ways to learn the on the job skills. And like you say, it might be that you get, sometimes the theory of a job and the reality of a job are totally different. You might get into your sort of work integrated learning experience and be like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. I do not want to do this job. And again, thankfully, I now know it now rather than later.
Right.
Um, but so I definitely, and just to clarify, I absolutely believe that university should be accessible to everybody. I think everybody should have the equal opportunity to go to university if that's what's right for them. But I would also, I think, like to see more diverse options, because I don't think it's the right choice for everybody, and it shouldn't have to be. I guess is
Right.
really where I come down on it. So I want everyone to have that equal shot. And then also to have the power and the confidence to know that they've got other choices in front of them if one of those other choices is a better choice.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. So that kind of makes sense in terms of part of like the I guess the issue in like that transitionary period. Uh, do you keep up with like like the discourse on campuses, like that get published in the news, like whatever, um like students feeling like they can't speak up, or certain things like that that go on?
Yeah, I do always. I always click on those articles. I always care about what the vibe is in higher ed, and I always click on articles about OU when I have the chance. So yeah. So yes, basically.
Yes, there was one. I don't know if you saw. There was one particular instance at OU with someone that caused quite a stir. I don't remember. It was a couple years ago or something. So these instances, I'm noticing more, because before I didn't really follow anything like this.
Mm,
But once I kind of just started watching the news a little more and kind of keeping up with what's generally going on in current events, I kind of started seeing more and more prevalence of seemingly issues on campuses of people saying one thing or another.
Mm.
Is this something that kind of when you were like doing your TA and the earlier teaching in Yale, is this something that you even remember from then, or does this seem kind of like a more recent thing? Because again, like I said, I just wasn't. Oh, I didn't pay attention. I
Yeah.
wasn't, so I don't know if this is a new thing, or this is something that's just kind of always been a thing.
So you're talking about this issue of do students have free speech on campus? And if you write an essay that is maybe a perfectly well-written essay, but the professor doesn't agree with the thesis, is that going to be a consequence for you? Is
Yeah,
that sort of what we're talking about? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think it certainly seems to be more in the public discourse. I'm not actually sure. I can't actually tell if it's a problem or not. I kind of suspect that it's not really. I think that, but I don't know. I don't know. I certainly think that, yeah, absolutely. Look, lots of things in life are really complicated. Some of our problems are super complicated. If they were easy problems, we would have solved them. So there's clearly room for rational people to disagree.
mhm,
When you're looking at history, there's multiple possible explanations. We don't know. We weren't there. We can't run it again as an experiment. When you're reading a piece of literature, there's multiple interpretations. It's a work of art. There's not one way to read it. But I do remember a teacher in high school, an English teacher, trying to help us learn how to read literature. And he's like, look, there isn't one right interpretation of this piece of literature. But sort of imagine like a flashlight shining down. You have some things that are right in the core of the light beam, and some things where they're getting a little bit of light, and some things that are still out in the darkness. So there's more than one right interpretation, but there's
mhm,
also wrong interpretations.
right,
And I think that sometimes people don't want to be told that they're wrong. And I do think, sure, potentially that can go both ways, right? There can be professors who don't want to hear people disagree with them. There also can be students who are so convinced that they're right that they don't want to hear anything else.
mhm.
I don't really know. I don't have a great answer for it.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious. Uh, when it became like a thing where it's like, okay, if the professor's stance or a student's stance, it's a professor versus student or student versus student, and they're on opposite sides of the coin. So what? Let it be. As long as if you feel X way, can you back up X, and if you feel Y way, can you back up
Yep,
Y?
that
And
is
okay, I
certainly
did
my
that, I
feeling.
did that, and as long okay, and if it's like, all right, I don't agree, cool, done.
Yeah. I
I don't get why
definitely
that's
think,
not a thing
yeah,
anymore.
there's a little bit of a danger sometimes as the professor that you you can unintentionally, I think, sometimes try to convince people to actually believe what you believe.
Mm,
And in a sense, okay, fine, you have more information. You've been trained to think and understand the topic in a certain way. So you sort of
right,
are the expert in the room.
right,
But ultimately, you're trying to help people learn to think. And so my feeling was always, I don't mind if you disagree with me, but I need to see evidence. If you're going to write an essay that totally disagrees with my understanding of why an event happened, I don't mind, but you have to show me actual evidence about why you believe that, and you need to argue it compellingly.
yeah,
And then maybe we can agree to disagree. That's okay. Again, generally speaking, there isn't only one way to understand some of this stuff. Um, but of course, a lot of it also gets tied up now with these hyper partisan battles, and it's a part of people's identity. And that's a really hard thing. I think that's part of the challenge is that
yeah,
people are making an argument not based on the evidence that's in front of them, but on the way that they identify and who they see themselves as. And then it's really hard to disagree because you're not just disagreeing with the argument. They feel like you're disagreeing with them as a person.
right.
And that's obviously far more challenging and far more threatening, I think, at that point.
Yeah, and it gets very messy, and then things are misinterpreted or misunderstood,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, and then because I see this, I'm like, oof, I don't know where you go from there at that point, and then it just seems like it just keeps spiraling down. It becomes like a dumpster fire.
It That's the word my dad uses to describe a lot of this stuff right now. He's like, Sarah, do you know what it feels like to be in a dumpster on fire? I says, because I do.
Yeah, I think that's fair and accurate.
Yeah.
Uh, so can we go back to your Yale experience? So
Yeah.
you went to, you said Claremont University first?
Yeah. So I was at Scripps College, which is one of the Claremont colleges
Uh-huh.
in Claremont, California, and then took about 2 years away and then started my PhD at Yale.
So was that during that 2 years? Well, when you graduated and then when you started, did you know you were gonna do a PhD, or in that 2 years is when you decided, I'm gonna do it?
I had started to think about it at the end of my undergraduate career, and I think I may have sat the GRE then. I can't actually exactly remember. I retook it because, again, I didn't, coming back to our themes about failure and resilience and that kind of stuff, I didn't do as well on the GRE as I really felt like I should have done. So I had started to think about it, but I hadn't applied and I hadn't made a definite decision. So I think maybe I started to develop a bit of a short list of schools I was going to apply to, and then did some work experience, retook the GRE, wrote my applications, went from there.
So you said you had like a list of schools. So what was like your process in even comprising a list and then shortening the list?
Yeah. So for anyone who's interested in pursuing a career in academia, I would suggest, read the news. But if you really are sure that that's what you want to do, the way that someone suggested to me that I do it was to look at schools that I would want to teach at and then look to see where their professors got their PhDs from, because that tells you something about what kind of training, what kind of pedigree do you need to have to be able to go get a job at the kind of school that you want to teach at. So I did some of that. And then there's a variety of sort of, there's Princeton review rankings and that kind of stuff of
Mhm.
not just sort of the best history programs, but also in specific sort of subgenres. If you want to do American history, where do you go? And doesn't matter if you want to do colonial American history or you want to do Civil War history, or if you want to do Chinese history, where do you go? What are the best programs? Because often there's often a lot of overlap, but there's also some schools have very specific strengths. And then it may be that a school you would never consider for British history actually has an amazing African history program. And that's really
Mm.
where you want to go if you want to do African history. So I did a little bit of that kind of background research. Then I reached out to some of the professors I'd identified whose work I thought was interesting, because when you do a PhD, you work really closely with your advisor and you're sort of a very small team of professors. So you really want to have a good working relationship with them. So I reached out to a number of professors and said, hey, here's who I am. Here's the kinds of questions I'm interested in. And some of them were very welcoming. And some of them, I remember one of them very clearly told me to find some new interests. So I didn't apply to that school.
Jeez.
But that was kind of the process. And then, like I said, sort of went from there and tried to figure out where I could have a good working relationship with a professor and what kind of school might have the community and the resources that I would want to feel supported and sort of stimulated and engaged.
How do you generally feel about those rankings? Like academic rank for colleges, like a specific college of a university, universities in general. I'm not sure where I stand on it, but I'm kind of curious to see how you feel.
I'm very skeptical.
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical that I think they tell you something. I just don't think they tell you everything. And I can tell you for sure that having been now in higher ed for a long time at this point, universities understand how the rankings work and they prioritize the kinds of activities that bump them up in the rankings. So they game the system a little bit. And if I think that's not inherently a bad thing, if there were things that we wanted to solve for in higher ed, if we wanted to solve for what kinds of universities actually have the best employment outcomes for graduates, or what kinds of universities help people leave with the lowest amounts of debt, if we factor those kinds of things into the rankings, universities will game for that. And then suddenly those things will matter more. Um, so if we, yeah, so I think that would be a way of fixing for some of the things that we care about. If we felt like there was something systemically that wasn't being done. So I think they tell you something. I don't think they tell you everything. And I also think that, again, there's no one right university for everybody. This is actually one of the other differences between Australia and the US. Australia is obviously a much smaller country,
Hmm.
but they've got a couple dozen universities, and the US has what, like 3,000 or something like that. So it's orders of magnitude different. So in the US, you really have the opportunity to figure out, what do you want to prioritize for? Do you want to be close to your family? Do you want to go to the place that has the most specific kind of degree that you want to study? Do you care about the place that's going to leave you with the lowest debt? Do you want to go to the place that has the best reputation? You can kind of figure out what matrix of things work for you and then do that. And I think that is kind of empowering.
So the entire country of Australia has a couple dozen of universities?
Yeah. I
Wow.
forget the exact number, but it's fewer than 40.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So they just don't have a culture here of this college search process that we do in the US, where you apply to a dozen colleges and you wait for your acceptance letters. It's just not the same here.
Hmm.
Most students go to a university in their hometown. And that's also partly because Australia largely is a pretty urban country. Most people live in one of the handful of big cities. They live in Sydney or Melbourne, or maybe they live in Brisbane or Perth. And they're Adelaide and Canberra. Like, so again, you can kind of count on both your fingers the numbers of cities that most people live in. And there is a rural hinterland.
Right.
Um, but mostly the people I know from Sydney, they went to university in Sydney. Um, that's just the expectation. So there's not really a culture of going away to school here. People don't do that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it threw me a little bit when I was trying to get used to it. Um, it's just, like I said, it's not an expectation. And so the universities that they have, again, the super high ranking ones are all massive institutions. Um, as large as sort of anything in the US, because that's just where all they've sort of centralized a lot of that higher ed.
Hmm. I guess while we're on the topic, so again, you went from the US to Australia. How was that? How how was the cultural differences initially for you? Now that you've been there a couple of years, do you feel like you're fully acclimated? Do you think there's some stuff you've kind of inherited from Australians now that maybe that you didn't have before? What was that transition like?
So it, in some ways, the transition from the US to Australia is pretty easy. We mostly speak the same language, although they have some wild slang here. We have a lot of the similar cultural touch points. Um, I think the hard part about it, there's always some little things, right? I miss knowing in the US, if you needed to buy like a power adapter, I'd know the 5 places you could go and which one would have the cheapest one and which one would have the biggest selection and which one would have the special sustainability eco one that I really secretly wanted. And I just know what all that looked like. And here in Australia, I never know where to buy anything. I was looking for windshield wiper fluid the other day, and I just ended up having to go to an auto store, which is fine. That's a totally reasonable place to
Yeah.
buy it. Just in the US, I would have known a couple of other places first that
Yeah.
I could have checked. Um, I think the hard part actually was that it came as part and parcel of this little bit of a career transition where I moved out of the teaching and researching part of academia and into eventually into this administrative role. But I didn't have this job waiting for me when I came to Australia. I had to stop and think about what I wanted to do next. And even though there are some challenges with higher ed and there are potentially some good reasons to not maybe be a professor anymore. And it didn't actually, for my reasons, it wasn't that I didn't like it. It wasn't that I wasn't enjoying my job at OU or that I didn't feel like I was good at my job at OU. It's actually just personal. It didn't fit with the other things that mattered to me in my life. It's a small college town, as you know. My husband couldn't get a job there, and it just didn't work for us anymore. And then our move to Australia meant that I was moving out of this career that I'd invested at that point a lot of years into pursuing. And that ended up being harder than I expected it to. I sort of thought I was okay with it. And then I got here and it turns out I wasn't actually okay with it. I had some processing I had to do. So it was a little bit of a sort of not just career reset, but identity reset. My husband's Australian. We'd moved here for him. So I was like, oh man, I kind of gave up my career and I'm following your job and now we're in your country. And I had to stop and think about what mattered to me and who I thought I was now in this new phase of my life. So it took a little doing. Um, but like we've been talking about, you figure out what matters to you, and you kind of get through to the other side.
Yeah, because that's obviously a I moved out of state for, again, out of state. I'm still within the
But it's a
states.
long way from your family.
Yeah, it was, and that's why I kind of ask people that do the out of state thing, or if they go somewhere else for like the study abroad, all that. Like I'll try and kind of get their feel of it, because for me there really wasn't any adjustment period.
Yeah,
Like as soon as I got there, I was like, all right, cool, I'm here. Let's
yeah,
get going. But I don't know how I'd feel if it was a different country, because at least in Australia there's no language change outside, like you
yeah,
mentioned, the slang. But like if you were to go elsewhere, it's like, well, now I gotta try and learn a new language,
yeah,
or I gotta
absolutely.
do this or that. um that's why I was kind of curious to see how that was. So given that difficulties, is and again, whatever detail you want, what's like the process that you kind of get to, because those are pretty big questions. Those aren't like smaller simple ones. Those are big impactful life changing conversations and contemplations. So how do you get to the other side of it?
Yeah. So I think that what I would recommend, at least that worked for me, and this is now through some trial and error. I did a lot of things that also, it turns out, did not help me. um, but I think part of what helped me sort of come to the other side, it was a little bit of a grieving process, and I think it's actually okay.
Yeah.
I'd spent a lot of time working for this thing, and it was a big accomplishment, and I was really proud of what I'd done. And it's okay to grieve that sometimes life takes you down a little bit of different paths, and you don't always see it coming. And these were choices that I'd made, and I could have made other choices. I mean, I could have, but I couldn't have necessarily had everything in my life, right? You have to figure out what matters to you. And I think the other thing that helped me on the other side of it was to think less about, oh, I always thought I'd be a professor, and now I don't have that, and now I don't know what I want anymore. But to try to think about what I wanted to feel in my life. When I come home at the end of the day, what do I want to feel? What other intangibles matter to me about my job? What kind of impact do I want to have? One of the things that I always found really meaningful about my teaching was that I felt, and I know how cheesy this is, I felt like I was helping some students actually learn and get better, and again, have more autonomy and more agency in their lives. That at some level I was helping them hopefully live better lives, have more impactful lives, whatever that meant for them. And so this job that I have now, I feel similarly. I actually really do think that some of the work that we're doing here, helping to inspire people to explore entrepreneurship, to develop these really innovative mindsets, I think is also helping people live meaningful lives for themselves. So I think thinking about that feeling, what did I want to feel? What kind of people did I want to work with? What did I want my day to day to look like? One of the things I knew I'd really regret giving up from academia is the fact that a lot of days I was kind of my own boss. You got to
Mm.
show up to your classes, you hold your office hours. But I was used to setting my own schedule and treating myself like a full adult. And I knew if I had to go to an environment where it was a straight up 9 to 5, you clock in, you clock out, I'd probably feel a little resentful. And I'm lucky that the university I work at now also treats its employees like adults.
Mm.
We have some core collaborative working hours, and we have lots of flexibility in the other ways that we get our jobs done. And I appreciate so much being treated like an adult. It really matters to me. So I tried to solve for some of those other things. If I couldn't have exactly the job title that I thought I was going to have, what else would be meaningful? What did I want in my life? Also outside of my job, right? Like that's
Right.
part of life, but it's not the only thing. What else would help me feel like I was, I don't know, I guess living as a whole person, I suppose. And again, that's also equally as cheesy, and I do know that.
No, it's okay. So do you think at some point, I mean, it's kind of hard to gauge it, but do you think at some point you would find a path back to being a professor, or would you want to do that at some point?
I'm still a little torn about this. I really loved it. I loved the research. I loved the teaching in particular. I really loved working with students, and I loved, as you know, I loved telling stories about people. Stories about people were great. I loved being able to share some of the really cool stuff about history with people, and that again, was really meaningful to me. So I do miss it. Um, I do think that there are some big structural challenges in higher ed right now. And I don't think that universities are probably going to look the same in 10 years time. I don't know what they're going to look like, but I don't necessarily know that they're going to look the same. And I think some of this has been a long time coming. From the 1970s, actually, we can see a stagnation of tenure track faculty, people who are invested fully in the university and know that they are invested fully in their students. And we've seen a stagnation of them and a rise in adjunct or part-time faculty, people who are just as smart and I know at some level want to care about their students as much. They don't have job security. They often are teaching maybe at 3 or 4 universities trying to make ends meet. They're making maybe like $3,000 a class. And so you got to be doing a lot of teaching to be able to, again, make ends meet at that point. So we've seen a rise in that. And what we've really seen a rise in and is actually administration and administrative salaries. They've skyrocketed. So if we're looking at why university costs so much more now than it used to, the stats are in and it is admin. And I also know I'm now part of the problem and not part of the solution. So there's that. That's part of the burden I now have to live with. But so I feel torn. I loved it. Some days I really want to go back. I don't know. It's got a lot of challenges. I don't know.
Why? If you know, what led to this? Like you said, it's kind of been budding since the 70s, but what kind of tipped the scale that it started kind of going more towards admin and like the teachers kind of seemingly became less of a priority?
I mean, I think it's a combination of factors. And again, I'll say I'm not a full expert on
Right,
this.
of course.
I think that the super skeptical, cynical side of me says, well, you know who makes the budget decisions is the administrators. Weirdly, they almost never cut their own salaries. Weirdly, they almost never cut their own staff, unless it's a true crisis, right? And I think there was a bit of a supply and a demand issue. There are currently still far more graduate students and far more PhDs and would-be professors than there are jobs for them. That's partly because so many of the positions are so specialized that even when I was fully on the job market in the US, I applied for a lot of jobs I was definitely not qualified for. But in terms of jobs I actually really was a good fit for, in any given calendar year, maybe 10 in the whole country. I applied everywhere. And like, I'd be a good fit for maybe, again, like 10 or 15 jobs. You do not like those odds. So there's a little bit, in some ways, it's sort of like professional sports. There's more people who are good at it and want to do it than there's actually room for it. So you have to not only be good and skilled, you also have to be a little bit lucky. So I think because there's that, it's like acting too at that point, right? Because there's always going to be someone else to take your spot. You don't feel like you can opt out. You don't necessarily feel like you can say, well, wait a minute, I'm not taking this adjunct role. You need to actually pay me a living salary. You need to pay me to teach your classes. Because if you don't do it, someone else definitely will.
You're more disposable.
Sorry, go ahead.
You're more disposable, pretty much.
You're far more disposable. And then I think, and I want to come back to that in just a sec, but the third factor, I think, is as we started to see a little bit of a withdrawing of public support from universities, a little bit less public funding per student, which we are definitely seeing, less and less at a public university of that funding. Actually, the revenue doesn't come from the state anymore, so more and more gets shifted onto students. Universities get run more and more like a business. I'm not sure that they actually really are or should be a profit-making business. I think that probably the purpose of a university is a little bit different, and I don't think they should be run like corporations. I think, though, that they are. And I think it's a little too bad to see people think about education as just a private good that somebody purchases that only benefits them. When it strikes me that I think ideally we'd all really love to live in a well-educated society. I think we all probably benefit when our neighbors and our doctors and our construction workers are all educated to the level that they need to be. That's how we get a functioning society. That's a public good, I think, that should be available to everybody. I think one of the things, just to briefly circle back to this adjunct professor issue, I think one of the challenges there is that everybody in the profession knows for a really long time that this is happening. I don't think students realize, I didn't realize when I was a student, and it was definitely happening then too, that so many of my professors weren't actually full time and that they didn't necessarily know they'd be working there next year. I think that's a real problem because they have they have to be on the job market looking for other jobs. I can tell you that's a huge drain on their time. And I also know I had some really good professors who were visiting professors. They weren't tenured. They weren't even meant to be there the next year. How am I ever supposed to go back and how can I build a relationship with them? How a year from now, if I need a letter of recommendation from them, they don't work there anymore. How am I ever supposed to, how can they invest in their students when they don't even know if they're going to be there next semester?
Right.
Some of these contracts that these people are on, the university basically doesn't have to tell them till a week before classes start whether they're teaching anything this year.
Wow.
How are you supposed to live like that? And as a student, how are you supposed to get a good education from someone who's living on under that kind of stress and is that kind of contingent labor? That's a bad outcome for everybody. The only people it's a good outcome for are the people who crunch the numbers, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's a grim picture.
It is a bit of a grim picture, and I'm really up in arms about it. As you can see, I'm ready for the revolution on that front. So
Yeah, so when you were kind of referencing a little earlier that in like 10 years time, whatever might be it won't look how it currently does. Is that an optimistic view on your end, or might get worse look on your end?
I suspect it's going to get worse before it gets better, but I think it will get better. I think that we all are going to have to think about what a 21st century education looks like. I think in some ways universities are still working off of a little bit of an outdated model that again doesn't necessarily prepare people for all the things that they might want to do. And in some ways, maybe it prepares you more for life and to be a good citizen, which are both really important things, than it does for any one particular job. I think what we will see is research has now shown that people are probably going to have, the research in Australia says 17 jobs over 5 different careers over the course. An average 15-year-old right now is going to have 17 jobs over 5 careers. We're going to be spending 30% more time on the job learning and reskilling and upskilling. And I think that at some level, we need to start thinking about learning probably as something that gets built into every stage of our career. It's not a one and done product. It's not like you go in and now you've bought your education and now you're good for the rest of your life. You've talked about, would you go back to get an MBA? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe it might be that at some point in the future, you want to do a smaller piece of learning. You don't necessarily want to do a full graduate degree, but you want to upskill or reskill, do a short course in something, do some kind of graduate certificate in something. And that's something that you need to keep current with new technologies or to learn a new approach that comes out that's developed. And I think that that's something that universities will have to adapt for, is that they won't maybe just be so much anymore for sort of that classic 18 to 22-year-old bracket. These are places where people are going to need to dip in and dip out over the course of their lives. I think if universities can adapt to that and can remember that I think anyway, their core goals are to help teach and educate people and to help generate new knowledge, and I hope to be a place for communal good to come out of. That's their core function. Their core function isn't to be a winning sports team. I think if they can remember that and sort of adjust to this lifelong learning, I think that would be a good step forward.
Do you think like tenured professors, is that a bad thing to have that option of becoming a tenured professor? I at least I was aware of one that I had at OU, and he was fantastic. Now, you can maybe argue this at any level of professorship that there's going to be good and bad, but just again, because you have a more understanding of the hierarchy and all, in your experience, does it seem like it's a bad idea to kind of have that where once you hit X amount of years, you're pretty much okay? Because then is there like do you like de-incentivize in a way? It's like, well, I'm going to be fine anyway.
I think that is probably, so the origin of that was the idea that if professors didn't have some kind of job security, how could they have free speech? How could they actually think clearly or write clearly or be provocative, which is sometimes important, if they didn't think that their jobs were secure? I have, I do think, sure, like in any job, occasionally I think people can get complacent. The professors that I've known who have been tenured, I haven't really seen that in them.
Hmm.
So I think it's possible, but it doesn't seem to be the majority case. And I
Okay.
think that what you can still obviously be fired for egregious misconduct.
Right.
So it's not like they're fully secure. If you stop doing your job, you will eventually get fired, which is right. That's absolutely
Yeah.
right. But I think it probably is a good thing that I think people probably do their best work when they feel like they've got some kind of security.
Hmm.
I know that there might be an argument, oh, you want to keep them fresh, keep them on their toes, keep them fighting for it. But I think that we've seen people who are living under heightened levels of anxiety don't make better choices, and I'm not sure they make better employees.
That's a
So
fair
I
point.
think in terms of creating a healthy culture where people, because I think the other thing too is when you're teaching, I think you're investing in the long term. Every time you start to teach a new class, you do so much work up front and you think that that'll be worth it because, you'll teach it multiple times and you'll get better every time. But I think to have people invest in their personal development, invest in being a good teacher, invest in their relationships with their students, try to actually spend, sometimes I'd spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours trying to find just the right image that I thought might help illustrate something. You don't do that if you don't think you're going to teach that class again. If you're like, well, this is the only time I'll literally ever teach this,
Yeah.
you just work with whatever's on the front page of Google, and that just doesn't seem, again, like it gets the best outcome for the people whom it's meant to benefit.
Yeah, because I guess that description you just gave, and pretty much just adjunct professors, I guess in general, are the complete opposite spectrum, right, of those tenured professors.
Yeah.
And then, so I guess you kind of see, well, if it, not that everyone necessarily needs to achieve that tenured, it's up to them,
Yeah.
but when they're also kind of like do or die essentially, because they might even rise to the occasion. Let's say, right?
Yeah.
They might make the most of that year. Might not matter anyway. They're like their sentence may have already been determined long before they even knew. Like the
Yeah.
administration maybe could have already known. Like doesn't matter what this person does, it's one and done.
Yeah.
But they might not know
Absolutely.
that because, like you said,
Yeah.
they can just tell them a week ahead
Yeah.
sometimes, and it's like, well, figure it out.
No, absolutely. So I think broadly, probably tenure, I think is a good thing. I would be happy to have, maybe some small modifications where, again, if you, let's say that you did get tenured and then you suddenly start getting consistently awful student reviews.
Hmm.
Okay, well, again, at that point to me, you're not doing your job. So there should be some kind of correction mechanism built in there. But I think that giving people job security, assuming that they're continuing to do their jobs well, and that you're treating them like respected members of the community, that to me only sounds like a good thing, I think.
How do those work, by the way? Those reviews. I think I remember getting those before. Like at least when did you have one for yours? Do they
Oh,
all do they
yeah, 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 yeah. For
do they
all,
all have them?
so I got student reviews, yeah, for all of my classes.
Okay, so that was all across
And
the board.
again, not everybody fills them out. So you
That's what I
get,
was gonna ask.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh no, definitely, definitely not everybody fills them out. Technically you have to at least like click through the survey before you can get your
Right.
grades. So they want to try to like compel you to fill them out, but
Yeah.
most people just wait, click, 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 and then just got their grades. So yeah, I mean, definitely OU was always a place that I think took your performance in the classroom seriously. And when I was starting out there, again, knowing that I'd done some teaching, but I was still new to OU, they had people come and observe my classes and try to give me some feedback on how I could
Hmm.
improve. And they always took student reviews seriously. If you, not the one off, because overall, I felt like overall I was always happy with my student reviews. I felt like people got what I was trying to do, but you'd always get one or two, especially in a big class that just wasn't, they weren't impressed with you. They weren't impressed with anything that you'd done. They didn't know why they were there. They didn't thought you'd added anything to their life. And so it was never that you got like the one bad review and they were like, oh, you got a bad review.
Hmm.
It was always about sort of the holistic approach, right? Broadly, are students responding to what you're doing? Broadly, do they feel like they're getting something out of it? And we looked at this every year on a peer review committee. I
Oh,
sat on
okay.
that committee a couple of times and looked at all the student reviews from my colleagues. And some of them were really inspiring. You'd be like, oh, wow, I thought I had some good reviews myself. This person's got stellar reviews. Well, I guess I need
Hmm.
to up my game. But they also considered it every year when they were, since I was not tenured, was on the tenure track. In theory, if I stayed on long enough and I'd done my job well, I think I would eventually have been tenured there. But every year since I wasn't tenured, they had to decide whether or not to keep me. And they looked at my student reviews every year to try to figure out, again, was I doing the right things and was I on the right path?
Got it. Okay. So I have one last one for you. It's kind of to circle back to something you're
Yeah.
mentioning earlier. Because I think I had a professor that said this to me and that was kind of aligned with what you said. I just wanted clarification. They had went to some school in the Midwest. It wasn't like a big name school, but I mean again, this was a professor that I thought very highly of. I thought they were very good at what they did. At least for me, I learned a lot from it. But
Yeah.
I forgot how the topic even came up. We were talking about because I was talking to him about like maybe school after the fact, where to go, this that,
Yeah.
and he was mentioning given where I got my PhD from, it puts me in this tier of schools that I can teach at. Is that that's kind of what you were mentioning earlier, or not quite?
I did sort of allude broadly to that when someone was advising me about where I wanted to go to graduate school, they said, look at the kinds of schools that you want to teach at and look at the professors in your department and see where they got their PhDs.
Right.
Because sometimes there are some places where, again, and especially given that there's an oversupply of PhDs at the moment, yeah, they feel like they only need
Mm,
to hire from Ivy League and one or two others, right? Other like top elite institutions. Because there's a couple of other schools that also consistently are right up there. Um, and there's other schools where sometimes they actually really want to hire from within sort of the broader region, right? There might be schools in the South that really want people who understand, who sort of have a little bit of a foundation themselves in the South, and they might want to hire PhDs from Duke, for example, which is also a
got it.
great program, or they want to hire a PhD from Rice, which is a great program, or Vanderbilt, or something like that.
Right.
Um, but there is certainly a sense that yes, if you this is a generalization, but if you get your PhD from one of these 8 schools, here's the kinds of schools you can teach at. If you get your PhD from one of these kinds of schools, well, then you'll be teaching at this kind of college. And um, so there is a little bit of sort of a feeder selection system, and it's not, I mean, again, it's not written in stone. Obviously, I'm confident that the job search committees read the applications that are in front of them. I think it's like a lot of systems of privilege a little bit though, where if you got your PhD from Yale, like I did, and I find out that there's a job opening at the university down the road, and I'm trying to figure out, or there's a job opening now in my department. Let's say I'm on the job committee. There's a job opening in my department. Um, my networks are going to be at places like Yale. And so when someone comes through who's got their PhD from Yale, I'm going to be like, oh, yeah, they worked with so and so. So and so was fantastic. They always turned
Mm,
out great students.
right.
And it doesn't even have to be explicit bias
Right.
to want to connect with people who you feel like have these similar lived experiences. So I think it's a little bit, there's a lot of different levels of privilege and selection in that. But yes, I do think for people who are considering going into academia, if you want to teach when you come out the other side, do think seriously about where you want to get your PhD. Then there's also other reasons maybe to do a graduate degree. If you just want to if you're really interested in the subject, you want to learn things and be surrounded by really interesting, engaging people for 6 years. I think that's great as well. And then you don't need to, it doesn't matter as much. And some kinds of PhDs also lend themselves, I think, quite well to a wide variety of career paths. I think
Mm,
this is something that we will see even more in the future, is that right now, for a while at least, a lot of PhDs have been sort of a one-way track into academia and teaching. I don't think that's going to be sustainable anymore. I think that all of us um, who are working in higher ed and people who want to go in to do a PhD need to think about a broad range of career paths, that this is, again, one way of professional development for a lot of different things.
got it. That's good to know. Yeah, because I'm sure people that are look at some point maybe are considering that might not know that that's something to at least keep in mind in the back of your minds that it might play in.
Yeah, and it certainly, I wouldn't have known if someone hadn't told me.
Right.
So I think it's one of the things that I was grateful for all along was really good mentoring, because come back to a theme that we touched on earlier. The first time you're doing anything, you don't know, and you shouldn't have to know. That's why you're there. You're there to learn. I didn't know how to pick a graduate program. I'd never had to do it before. I had people who did know and they helped me, and that was really important, and I was always really grateful. So I think maybe that sense of mentorship is one reason why I always felt so compelled to try to help pay it forward for students.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Dr. Kinkel, that I think that wraps up pretty much everything that I had for you, and then some, frankly. So,
Well, no,
so
thank you so much.
yeah,
Thank you so much for,
of course.
like I said, for inviting me. I'm super flattered to be invited, and it's just so nice to get a chance to catch up with you.
Yeah,
I'm just
definitely.
really, really chuffed to see you.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for making the time. It could have very easily slipped off the radar because, like I said, we've been talking for some months, and
I know
part of
we've
it
been
was
lining
the
this up for a while. Yeah.
yeah, part of it like on our end here because where we are specifically, there was some extracurricular stuff happening outside of here, so that didn't help. But now that we kind of got everything situated, we're happy to have been able to have you on. So thanks again for making the time and coming on.
No, it's absolutely a pleasure, and I hope we get a chance to chat again soon.
Definitely, definitely. Thanks again.
All right. Take
Mm,
care.
bye.